All right, we'll get started and then people will continue to join us. Um, I am Riyad Bahour. I'm coordinator for the Global Studies program here at Sac City College, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our final day of Reimagining the Future, Earth and Global Justice Days at Sac City. The idea with Reimagining the Future was to reconnect to our local and global communities, reestablish the idea of connection and interconnectivity. And this program that we're about to hear is actually the perfect way, perfect theme to look at reconnection through a global justice lens. It's really my pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Linda Quiquivix, who wins the prize for Best Bio. Linda's a popular educator of Maya roots who saves seeds, makes art, and loves books. Politically raised by Palestinians, Zapatistas, Panthers, and jaguars, she organizes from Chumash lands towards a world where many worlds fit. She's currently working on a book entitled Palestine 1492 that places the Palestinian struggle into conversation with the last 500 years. So, Linda, we're really happy to have you and to hear about your project and to engage with you on this theme of From Chiapas to Palestine, Global Rebellion and Justice since 1492. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Riyad, for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here. I love community colleges. They're among my favorite spaces to speak. It's a lot more advanced, the conversations that we have there when it comes to anti-colonial movements in a lot of ways, because community colleges, a lot of the time, the students there, and I'm a product of a community college, very much working class and struggle, some kind of structural position from below. And that position, I have found, makes it easier to have conversations about how Palestinians are human beings. We don't have to argue about that. And then we can move to more advanced discussions, which is something that I found more difficult to do in the more elite institutions and the more elite universities. So very, very happy to be here. As Riyad says, this is a conversation from Chiapas to Palestine. And what that means is it's a conversation with you all about how Maya accompaniment work with the Zapatista movement, which is a Maya rebel organization in Chiapas, in the most southern state of Mexico, on the border with Guatemala, in the Maya world. How Maya accompaniment with the Zapatistas has had me see the Palestinian struggle for liberation in a different way that is more common. And so that's what I'm going to present today. It's the book that I'm writing. Most of the time when we learn about the Palestinian liberation struggle, we're taught about it from the 19th century forward, when Jews from Europe were fleeing anti-Semitism there and migrating all over the world. And one of the places they went to was Palestine to try to feel safe. And that is a really important place to try to understand the creation of Israel-Palestine and the struggle with borders and land. What I found is that when I kept hearing the story being told from that starting point of the 19th century, what it was not able to do was really talk about how the Palestinian liberation struggle and the Jewish liberation struggle as well are connected more globally to other struggles. And so I like beginning in 1492, because this is a common moment when the world, the globe, was having something imposed or began having something imposed on it. And what I argue is that one world has been trying to be imposed on the entire globe, one way of being, one way of living. I'm not the only one who argues this. Many of us coming from the struggle tradition in academia, especially in Latin America, have a framework like this, that this is that what we've seen over the last 500 years is a battle to extinguish other worlds and impose one. And so what I'll be presenting to you is a critique of that imposition of one world and how it looks in Israel, Palestine, and then what it means for us. And so what I'm going to do is begin by giving you that framework very briefly, introducing it to you, and then giving you like the case study of how it plays out in Palestine, Israel, and then asking us or encouraging us all to reflect on how we may be seeing this world in our lives as well. And that way we can better critique it, better pay attention to it, and hopefully be able to better imagine and create other ways that we can live. And so the way that this framework differs from more mainstream frameworks or more common frameworks in talking about Palestine and Israel is that it doesn't focus first on identities. It doesn't focus first on these are Jews, these are Arabs, these are Palestinians. Instead, what it does is it focuses on the question of domination. There's domination taking place, there's oppression taking place. What does that look like in that geography that is Palestine, Israel? What does it look like in other geographies? For example, Europe. Is the Jewish experience in Europe the same as the Jewish experience in Palestine? I argue that it's not. The Jewish experience in Europe, particularly with the Nazi Holocaust and even well before that, is that Jews have been relegated in Europe to a position of below as inferiors to non-Jews or Christians who are understood as above. So the framework is an understanding that there exists a logic in the world of 1492 that divides difference into superiority and inferiority. So anytime we encounter each other, we encounter difference, we encounter someone who's not us, we are taught to rank each other as either superior or inferior according to different measures, whether it's race, whether like phenotype or gender or sexuality or class. We have a lot of these rankings that we see in everyday life. And my argument is that the world does not have to be like that. Many worlds are not that way, but the world imposed on us by 1492 is that way. And I'm here then to show you how it plays out in Palestine, but also want to encourage us all throughout the presentation, and then we can break out afterward in conversation about like, does this make sense to your life? Is this something that you've witnessed? If so, how have you lived it? How have you experienced it in your own context? And so I want to begin by talking about context. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to begin with this slide. Can you all see? Yes, perfect. So this slide is a communique, a part of a communique from the Zapatistas. The Zapatistas are, like I said, a Maya rebel movement, an anti-colonial movement. They call themselves the product of 500 years of struggle. And when the world first learned about their existence, it was when they rose up against the Mexican government in 1994. And on January 1st, 1994, pointing out how the Mexican government has never been there for Native American people, for indigenous peoples. It's been recently also it had been trying to become more and more quote unquote modern by making all land in Mexico private property and continuing dispossession of Native Americans. And so the Zapatista movement rose up. And when the movement rose up, it received a lot of support, and it received some criticisms, and in particular from a very machista kind of society that sadly Mexico is. Some critics of the Zapatistas started to accuse the spokesperson of the Zapatistas of being gay, as if that was going to be an insult. And the Zapatistas did not take that as an insult at all. They took it as an opportunity to tell the world who they were. And so the spokesperson, Marcos, came out with a communique in response to this accusation, quote unquote, that he was gay. And instead of saying, no, Marcos is not gay, he said, yes, Marcos is gay, and then continues. Marcos is gay in San Francisco, Black in South Africa, an Asian in Europe, a Chicano in San Isidro, an anarchist in Spain, and I've highlighted there a Palestinian in Israel, a Mayan Indian in the streets of San Cristobal, and I've also highlighted a Jew in Germany. And then Marcos continues, giving the structural position of those who are oppressed, those who are quote unquote below, in other words, have someone above or others above stomping on them, crushing them, but always giving context. So if you notice here, a Palestinian in Israel and a Jew in Germany, here we see that to be a Jew in Israel is not the same as being a Jew in Germany. The below in Israel is Palestinian. The below in Nazi Germany was a Jew. And so this is very, very typical of the way that the Zapatistas understand struggle and domination, is that there's context first, and then there are the identities that are shuffled into those positions of above and below, and they change. They change according to context. And so again, just wanted to put this out here to help ground us in our discussion, and also to give examples of how this analysis of above and below with context looks. That way we might be encouraged to think about how we've seen it play out in our lives. Like, when have we been placed above? When have we been placed below? And, you know, with higher learning, college very much is a marker that places us above others in terms of intelligence, even if it's not an actual fact that if you get a college degree, you're more intelligent than someone that does not. It's not a fact. It just means that you got a college degree and that you have gone to college. Hopefully that's what that means. And just want then to say that what our society does, what the dominant world does, is it's always marking us and shuffling us into these positions of superiority and inferiority, okay? So this is how I want to begin this conversation, which normally begins like this. This is a very powerful 4-panel map. It's one of the first maps that I ever saw when I was learning about the Palestinian struggle. And it's a 4-panel map of how the creation of the state of Israel has come at the expense of Palestine. It's come at the ethnic cleansing of Palestine over the years. And it gives you how the United Nations first partitioned Palestine to make it so that Jews from Europe could live in Palestine in a Jewish majority state, which then would mean the kicking out the native Palestinians in those areas that the UN decided would become Israel. So the white areas. And Palestinians, how they refused this, how they refused their own dispossession. And so what's been going on since then is a struggle against the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And sadly, what is also happening is that it's being done in the name of the oppressed of Europe. And so then it makes it really difficult for folks to try to wrap their heads around what's happening. Jews are victims who are trying to live in a safe place, a place that they've created, a state called Israel. But sadly, it's coming at the expense of others. So it's creating other victims. So something that I argue is the way that the world of 1492 allows us to exist is if we step on someone else. So I'll come back to that. And what I want to do is show you how this is connected to that world of 1492, even if these maps begin in the 20th century. So if we go to 1492, what happened in 1492? As we know, Christopher Columbus, trying to sail east by going west, bumps into a landmass he didn't know existed, many Europeans did not know existed, which was then called the Americas. And soon after that, going on a Catholic mission that he was for the crown in the Iberian Peninsula, one of the Castile and Aragon in the Iberian Peninsula, not yet Spain, but soon to be Spain, would end up wanting to invade these new lands to convert folks into Catholicism. And Portugal, which was already sailing around Africa and invading there, starts to want to get in on the action with the new, with these new lands. And so then the Pope steps in and asks them not to fight. There are two Catholic kingdoms, so why don't the Spanish invade everything west of this green line and the Portuguese invade everything east of this green line, which is the famous Treaty of Tordesillas. And then, so then what we get is Brazil speaking Portuguese, whereas the rest of the Americas, the large majority of the Americas spoke Spanish or speak Spanish. And so this is why we get something like this. And what's important about this moment is not so much that they were able to map out the world with that line, but that global linear thinking was introduced. The idea that Europeans could step outside the world, the planet, and carve it up and divide it amongst themselves as objects of property. This is the introduction of this done at a global scale, because now there was a conception of a globe. And so then what that does is it starts to create these viceroyalties, like these, you know, these ownership plots of the Spanish crown or the Portuguese crown. And so then what we get, and this is again 1492 forward, so this is a couple of centuries before Israel-Palestine becomes a situation of war and colonization. But what I want to do is just show you, this is the genesis of this global logic precedes Palestine, Israel by a couple hundred years. But here we are in our study area, Middle East and North Africa, circa 2000s. You'll see there that there are borders there, but there weren't borders before under the Ottoman Empire, which is what was ruling the lands before World War I. It was with World War I that the Ottoman Empire falls and these borders are created. But before that happened, this is the extent of the Ottoman Empire. And there weren't borders. There were more like frontiers that would overlap with maybe other empires. And also the seas were really important territorially because sailing was so important at that time. And of course, it still is as a mode of transport and commerce. And so here we are getting closer to where Palestine is. And if you look here, it wasn't until 1923 that Palestine is carved out. There are, of course, people living there known as Palestinians, but these borders, this border thinking is very, very new. And it was new to Palestine and the region, particularly after World War I. And actually those borders of Europe themselves, those countries themselves are new. A lot of European countries weren't unified until the 19th century. So all that to say is that borders are not natural, they're not eternal, they're actually very new, and they arise for specific reasons when a society calls for them. And what the society that was calling for them was a colonial society that was trying to make it so that the colonizing powers would respect each other's territories. Here we have, on the eve of the end of World War I, a secret agreement between the French and the British and the Russian Empire about how these territories were going to be carved up once they beat the Ottoman Empire. In the meantime, they were rallying the ground, the local population, so that the local population could help overthrow the Ottoman Empire, but at the same time, and we're telling the local population, if you help us, then you'll get your own independence. But at the same time, secretly, the great powers were negotiating between themselves over who was going to own what, who was going to colonize what, or quote unquote, offer protection. Because at this time in the early 20th century, colonialism was because of so much resistance, was going, had a horrible name, had a really bad name. And so the colonizers were trying to call it something else. So they would call it like a mandate or protectorate or something like that. But again, what I want to point out, and this is something that is rarely done when talking about Israel-Palestine, is where this logic has existed before. And it actually, right next door in Africa, the very famous scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, that lasted for several decades, where literally Europeans got together and rolled out a map of Africa and decided who was going to own what. This was not a conversation that they had with all the local population whose lives they were affecting. Instead, it was very much a from above kind of carving up of the world and owning it. And so this ends up being the kind of like the template for when there is independence in Africa and there are new nations that are created. So like if you look at a contemporary map of Africa right now, it follows a lot of these carvings and you'll see a lot of straight lines too. And again, that is that logic that prioritizes like an administration from above rather than what people from below, people on the ground actually want and what they need and what they desire. So here is very famously Cecil Rhodes, the idea being that he's going to take over everything, all of Africa from the Nile to South Africa. And even before that, these viceroyalties, as I mentioned, this logic of cutting up the world and owning it in chunks, which is a precursor to the nation state, has already happened in the Americas. So then when we get to Palestine in 1923 and we get its borders cut up, we also at the same time are seeing a lot of anti-Semitism within Europe. Europe itself is dividing itself up into these containers too, into these nation states. And the idea being that, well, we're not going to have a monarchy to tell everybody what to do. Instead, the people are going to rule. But then the problem becomes, well, who are the people? Because that's actually a lot of rights that they're going to get. Are we sure we want all of the people? And then they kind of start like adding like standards. Well, to be French means you need to speak French, you need to have this history, et cetera, et cetera. And so then what happens is that those who don't meet that standard become discriminated, oppressed, assaulted. And that happens with many peoples, and Jewish people are some of those victims of the nation state. And so then they have many debates amongst themselves of how to struggle. There are some like having a global workers struggle or assimilating more to not look so Jewish anymore, which is actually something that really took off with Reform Judaism. Zionism was another debate, another possibility or proposal. And that idea is what created the state of Israel. And it's the idea that the reason why Jews are oppressed all over the world is because they're a minority all over the world. And what can fix that is if they are a majority somewhere in the world. It doesn't matter where, as long as they're a majority in the new world that is governed by nation states and democracy. And initially, the Zionist movement didn't care where it was going to be. It was going to be in Uganda or in Argentina. They were just asking the great powers, hey, can you give us some of the land that you've colonized so we can create our state? And so that Zionism is a model where the oppressed ask for their liberation from their own oppressors, from the great powers, telling them, hey, we can actually serve a purpose for you. And when it comes to Palestine, what they said was, we can be a drop of civilization in a sea of barbarism, which for the great powers, learning that there was petroleum in the area was really attractive, because then they would kind of have like a proxy military base in that area. I see a hand from Mike. I'm happy to take a comment or a question.
Yeah, hi, how you doing? So I jumped in late and I've got a quick question to ask you. When I'm looking at this chart or image you're showing, Arab state, Jewish state, international zone, is the Arab state another word for saying that was the Palestinian areas carved out by the UN?
That's really great. Thank you for that. Yeah. So that's exactly where I was heading to. When the world recognizes the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust after World War II, the United Nations takes up the proposal from the Zionist movement to create a Jewish majority state in Palestine. The problem is that there's already people living there, Palestinians. And so what the United Nations does, and this is not the only place it did it, this also took place in India, Pakistan, with a lot of population shuffling that continues, where tensions continue, enormous tensions, nuclear even tensions exist. And so what the United Nations did with Palestine is precisely that. It carved it up into two, like Solomon's biblical baby, like cut it up and try to make it so that there could be a Jewish area and a Palestinian area, which they called an Arab state. And then the purple international zone, that's where Bethlehem and Jerusalem are, which are centers, especially Jerusalem, that are very important to the three monotheistic religions. And so the idea was to make that an international zone. And
so basically what you're saying is this is a UN problem. They started it. They need to undo what they started or fix this. This is amazing. They could just go in there, carve up land and go, therefore it is. Yeah. And what, how many years later, 50 years later, close to, or 60 or 70, give or take, they didn't bother fixing this. I'm just blown away on that.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is a tension point, a major tension point with the Palestinian liberation struggle. The United Nations creates this problem, yet we're going to the United Nations to ask for the solution. It's a conundrum that exists within the liberation movement. And again, the United Nations is a product of the world. This is a world problem, is something that I argue. This isn't just an Israel-Palestine problem. This is a problem of the world. This is not unique or peculiar. It has its specificities. There's only one Jerusalem, for example, right? But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a similar logic working here than has been working in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and even within Europe. So what happens here is that we get the partition. The native Palestinian population completely rejects it, as do neighboring Arab states. They go to war with the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement gets a lot of weapons and support from the West, and the Zionist movement becomes victorious and creates Israel. Armistice lines, not borders, but armistice lines where they're kind of like ceasefire lines, and so then for what happens is that Palestinians, about 800,000 Palestinians who are native to what becomes the state of Israel, are now made refugees. They're made refugees into this little strip called Gaza and the West Bank of the River Jordan. And they become refugees in the state of Jordan, in Syria, and in Lebanon. And what ends up happening 20 years later, meanwhile, there's still a lot of resistance to go back home, return to their villages. But there is a 6-day war, another war with the neighboring Arab countries, and Israel within 6 days ends up taking more land from Syria called the Golan Heights. It takes the West Bank and Gaza, which have refugees from the war of 1948, just 20 years before. And it takes the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. And the idea is that it wants to trade land for peace, even though it starts to settle those areas right away with civilian populations who just want to make their lives. It starts putting civilians in these areas completely illegally and starts to build like suburbs for them, and to make it harder to give back those lands, because then public opinion would look at people now being dispossessed, Jews being dispossessed. And so the optics, of course, are horrible. And of course, the feeling of dispossession is real. What ends up happening is that Israel and Egypt come to an agreement, Camp David Treaty of 1979, where Israel returns the Sinai Peninsula in exchange, Egypt has to no longer support the Palestinian struggle. And that ends up happening with the neighboring Arab regimes too. Jordan and Syria and Lebanon end up kind of abandoning the Palestinian struggle, where the Palestinian struggle becomes isolated and begins to believe that it is the only struggle really happening in the world, and stops in a lot of ways thinking of itself as regional and global, particularly where it had been a very global struggle in the 60s and 70s, particularly with the global phenomenon of guerrilla warfare in Vietnam and in the Americas and Cuba, for example. But it becomes very much isolated with these moves between the Arab regimes and Israel, and then in particularly with the peace process, Oslo peace process of 1993, which comes from the uprising of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, embarrassing Israel in the global scene and forcing Israel to recognize that Palestinians do exist and did exist when Israel was created, even though it had denied it for such a long time. And what has happened, though, is that what was supposed to become, the peace process was supposed to create a two-state solution where Gaza and the West Bank would become the state of Palestine, that Arab state that was never created. And Israel would remain Israel within the armistice lines. But what has happened is that Israel has never ceased to build more suburbs, more settlements in the West Bank in particular, which has now created a situation where the West Bank is not a contiguous, containerized territory that, that looks like a nation state, and is more like Swiss cheese. So if you look at this panel again, at the last one from 2005 forward, is that you see that the green areas, the Palestine in the West Bank, looks a lot like Swiss cheese. There isn't a geography there that could easily create a nation state for Palestine. And so what folks are saying and been saying for the last couple of decades is that there is no two-state solution possible anymore. The situation is a one-state solution, and that is because Israel actually controls all of those areas. It controls the borders of the West, of who gets in and out of the West Bank and Gaza. And with Gaza, it works a lot in conjunction with the Egyptian government to police that border. And the Egyptian government, of course, is an ally with Israel and the United States with the Camp David Treaty. So what I did with my dissertation, when I did a dissertation on these borders precisely in geography, what I wanted to do was to try to figure out, like, why do we talk so much about borders as a solution? I came in very critical of borders. I'm from an undocumented migrant family from Guatemala in the United States. And so I had heard of borders all of my life as violent. And so when I started to accompany the Palestinian struggle and started to hear a lot about borders, I wanted to, and see maps like this, what I wanted to do was see how were these borders first conceived? How were they created? Because I already knew borders were not natural, and I wanted to find this out for Palestine. And so what I ended up finding was that there is a border to the state of Israel, but it's not what you think. And so I'll explain that now. As I mentioned, the world of 1492 is a world of aboves and belows. Every time there is a difference, almost every time, it needs to be ranked as superior and inferior. And what the world of 1492 did was, for Europe, it created for them an idea that there is a Europe and there is a non-Europe. And that was important because Europe was battling internally with itself. It's been for such a long time. Europeans have been enslaving each other, for millennia. And there's been a lot of resistance internally and instability. In order to create that stability that would become known as international law, that stability of peace, what the European powers did was relegate war to the spaces of non-Europe. Non-Europe is where you can go conduct your lawlessness, piracy, whatever you want. You can take territories away from each other. Don't do that in Europe. Europe is for peace, non-Europe is for war. And this division has existed since, and it even exists internally. Like if you think about a gated community, for example, or a suburb in the United States, the suburbs in the United States were created for peace and the inner cities for war. That's where you go get your drugs. That's where you go do the red light district. But in the suburbs, don't bring any of that stuff here. You go over there if you want to go conduct lawlessness or break the law. This stood for quite a long time, this division of Europe, non-Europe, in a very explicit way, up until the 20th century with the anti-colonial resistance struggles, and of course, World War II, the First and Second World Wars, and the creation of the United Nations that called for a universal human equality. What ends up happening, though, is that in saying that, well, if you're a human being, then you have rights. It sounds really great, but the problem has been that that world has never critiqued itself in terms of how it ranks. If all humans have rights, then what it automatically assumes as well is that non-humans don't have rights. This is a philosophical move in the Western philosophical tradition. It assumes a negation of difference rather than like walking side by side with difference. There's a ranking, superior and inferior. And so then to create a universal human equality, there's again like this idea of, well, if the nation state is governed by the people, who are the people, there's a lot at stake in that, right? Just like with universal human equality, there's a lot at stake with this idea of the human, because the human has rights. So then what ends up happening is that this idea of the non-human, whether it's the terrorist or the communist or whatever, whoever is resisting against the dominant world being imposed on them will be called non-human, and it's okay to kill them, to torture them, to maim them, because they don't really deserve human rights like everyone else. And so we see that the context here of this above and below changes. So like in Israel, Jews are the ones that are deserving of peace, and non-Jews are those who are deserving of war. In the United States, white people, largely, especially upper middle class, not really working poor white people, are quite different. They're not totally white, but in the US, just abstractly, white people are understood to be deserving of peace and non-white people deserving of war or imprisonment, mass incarceration, death. In the nation state, it's the citizen that is superior and the non-citizen that is inferior. Again, peace and war. So we think of the US-Mexico border. That blue line actually is a really, really good stand-in for that border, because the US is relatively a peaceful geography and Mexico is a relatively violent geography. But the two work together. The US and Mexico are so economically tied, it's like they're one unit, and that division exists in terms of safety and violence. With patriarchy, we see this as well. Males and non-males. Males are deserving of peace, non-males of war. We can also say this in terms of males are deserving of the rights and non-males of all of the responsibilities. Capitalism is another one, value and non-value. So if you are a worker and you create value, then you are deserving of protection. But if you are a tree, for example, and even though you work, or if you're a bee, even though you work, you don't produce value, you're just doing it for free because Mother Nature is free, then you're relegated over to the death and destruction of the below. And again, with universal human equality, it's human and non-human. And we have the global war on terror that shows us how this plays out. Anyone called a terrorist, how Palestinians sadly are considered, then it marks them as deserving of war. Back to then universal human equality, Israelis are deserving of peace, Palestinians deserving of war in the dominant discourse of the West that continues calling Palestinians terrorists because they are resisting their own dispossession. And so what I argue is that when we look at something like this, what this geography does is if you go visit Israel, Palestine, you will find that if you're in those white areas known as Israel, it's a relatively peaceful geography than in those areas that are green, like Gaza or the refugee camps in the West Bank or other cities in the West Bank. And what I argue is that the border at work in Israel, Palestine is not really a border on the map. It's this line. It's the line of the above and the below. The border of Israel is the line between the human and the non-human. It's the Jews and the non-Jews. It's not necessarily a border that's on a map. That is actually just one way that this above and below construction materializes in the world. But the conception itself, what it looks like in Israel, Palestine, a lot of the time is that the Israeli homes are protected and Palestinian homes are demolished. What we get a lot of the time in situations like this, and again, I encourage you to think about if this makes sense to what you've seen in your life. I've seen it quite often in my life in the United States, is that noticing that the below, the oppressed, wants to go above in order to survive, in order to have that peace, wants to go above. But what ends up happening is that to go above assumes that there has to continue being a below. And so what's happened, for example, with the Zionist project is that the oppressed of Europe have gone above with empire, and the price of that ticket has been to create other oppressed peoples, which are the Palestinians. And sadly, the Palestinian leadership has done that internally too. The Palestinian leadership understands itself as more worthy of being above. And those Palestinians in Gaza, for example, they're worthy of being below. They're the inferior, they're the bad Palestinians and we're the good Palestinians. This is very much the Palestinian leadership in the negotiations, how they understand. And also, like whenever there are in the West Bank protests in support of Gaza, whenever Israel is bombarding Gaza, the Palestinian Authority will come in and quash those protests to try to show the West that it knows how to police its own people. What we learned from anti-colonial movements is that this is not a solution. Assimilating into the above continues this entire framework. And so then what needs to happen is an exit away from this framework to create another world, out of this world to create another world. And we see it here in the United States with the Black Panther Party in a statement in support of Palestine back in 1970, called for a world in which all people can live. A world in which all people can live. The Zapatistas in present day do something similar, but they have a twist on it. They say a world where many worlds fit. And I think that the reason why they are more specific in that way of respecting other worlds is because with the Cold War, with the Soviet Union versus NATO, that was a war of the first world versus the second world. The first world being capitalism, the second world being state capitalism, which is Soviet communism. This is why there was a third world movement that was created to say, no, we're something else. We don't want to be either first world or second world. We want to be third world. But so much of the third world was forced to choose between NATO and the Soviet Union in the so-called Cold War, which was not cold for anyone else besides the Soviet Union and NATO. It was hot. It was all over the Americas. There was war in Asia as well, and Africa, overthrows of governments, excuse me. So what the Zapatistas say by a world where many worlds fit is we want a world where we don't have to be forced to pick this world or that world. We have other worlds that are already alive. We have many of our traditions and new ones that we are creating. So our challenge is how are we going to create a world where many worlds fit? In other words, how do we create a world where we respect each other rather than continue this superior inferior logic? And just really quick, just to show you some more current events from just late last year, Israel designated 6 Palestinian human rights groups as terrorist organizations, just so that you can see how this plays out, this logic of those deserving of human rights and those non-deserving. You just call them terrorists and they're immediately non-deserving. And those organizations were Palestinian organizations that engage research and development, law, women, children, prisoners, and farmers. So it's basically like almost every area of Palestinian everyday life is being considered terrorist by Israel. And so again, here we can see that play out, that above and below border of Israel is the human and the non-human. And sadly, as long as the Palestinian leadership and all of our leaderships in our movements, because this again is not unique, like with immigrant rights struggles, we have the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant. With Black struggles, we have the respectable Black person versus the non-respectable Black person, right? This happens all the time. If we are going to continue doing this, we're going to continue this entire logic and just have Black and brown faces or women's faces up in high places as the above, while there continues to be a below. So I'll end it there. And I'm really curious to hear from you all to see what you think about this framework. Is it something that is speaking to you? Do you see it in your life? How? And how do you think we can create something different? Are there other worlds that you also see that don't move with this logic? Are there worlds that rather than above and below are more side by side? And if so, I encourage you to share those with us and to share those with the world, because we need many more of these kinds of examples. These worlds exist. It's just that we're taught there's just one world, or one world that's worthy because the others are backward, right? And what I want to argue, and what many of us argue who are in similar struggles, is that no, there are many worlds already that exist. Palestine is one of them. We don't really hear about how it's different in its own way. What we hear instead is how it's the same as the West. And so we have a hard time understanding then that there are other possible ways of living. So I'll stop sharing there, and I already see a hand again from Mike. Please go ahead, Mike.
Yes, hi. I've got a question to ask you. Thank you for the presentation, by the way. It was real good. The perspective that you bring up, your ideals and your thoughts, and your the political theory behind that. What you're talking about sounds very similar to what's going on in the Ukraine, as far as them having to make a choice to join NATO, not join NATO. It's just almost parallels what you're talking about, which I just wanted to bring out. Is that basically what's going on? And two, I wouldn't say all Israelis view Palestinians as terrorists, because they do commerce and business together. They do coexist, but I think that's a little too sharp as far as definition, defining Israelis, because you got to understand, in Israel, there's not just Israelis, native, there's European Israelis, and they're actually not getting along with each other right now because they have two different perspectives of the world. The Israeli Europeans, the Europeans that immigrated to Israel view there should be a two-state solution. And the Israelis, natives, most of the generational older ones are against that. So there's actually a clash between two groups within inside Israel right now. And this has been going on for the last 5 or 6 years. Benjamin Netanyahu, who was finally gone, was fighting the European view. So I don't know. I think that we might want to relook at that and understand their culture that currently exists inside Israel in relation to the Palestinians, because it's very, very important. Because remember,
Mike, I want to just a little housekeeping.
Let me close it real quick.
Okay.
The last time Clinton and Barack and Arafat talked and negotiated, they agreed to a two-state solution. They agreed to this. The problem was immigration of Palestinians, the right of Palestinians to immigrate to the new Palestinian state. That was the only thing that stopped it from going forward. They actually agreed to it. They got everything they asked for from Barak, B-A-R-A-K, one of the other Israeli prime ministers.
Mike,
That's
just
it.
a little housekeeping. We have about 9 minutes left, and then we'll end really promptly. So if other folks have comments, responses, questions, we're gonna fit them in.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mike. I think it is important also. Yeah, if we have a lot more time, there's so much nuance to what's going on internally to Israel, for example. And yeah, if Israel is very diverse, the state was created for European Jews, but they had a hard time filling it up to be a majority, sadly, because so many Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And so then they were recruited from Jews from non-European areas, and sadly treat those Jews who are not white, who are brown phenotypically, as second-class citizens. And there's even a Black Panther Party of Israel that was created by those Jews who are those second-class citizens. Sadly, that was in the 70s, but sadly they moved right-wing because the below, because we're oppressed does not mean we're automatic revolutionaries to create another world. A lot of the time, the below, we are given the option to survive. The only option we're given to survive is if we go above others. This is the importance of needing to exit out of that logic, of that world, and create another one, which is more than just a logic. It's actually in the material world. It's the infrastructure. You know, it's everywhere. And very quickly, yeah, with Ukraine, like it's always it's not surprising to me, sadly, that whenever we hear about the news of Ukraine and other struggles, is that we don't hear about the movements on the ground who have different ideas. Instead, we hear about the same thing. Is it NATO or is it Putin? Is it NATO? Is it Putin? And there's so much more difference and debate happening down below. Some of it right wing and some of it left wing, but we're not really hearing a lot of that. I also want to move over to Antonio Lopez in the chat, and is assimilation an example of this? And yes, absolutely, assimilation. In the United States, the history of immigrants in the United States has becoming white. Italians, Jews, Irish. The way that these communities have become white is not necessarily by this quote unquote hard work bootstraps, picking up by your bootstraps. It is very much by showing how you're not Black. How you don't hang out with Black people, you're not like Black people, you're anti-Black. So white supremacy in the United States has this corollary of anti-Blackness. And very sadly, migrants from Latin America are learning or learn that right away. They're traumatized, they're migrating, they're trying to survive, and immediately they see US Americans treating them better as quote unquote harder workers and not criminals, which is code for you're not Black or you need to not be like Black people. And even sociologists have a term for this, for those of us hanging out with Black people too much, is quote unquote downward assimilation. We're not assimilating the way that the European migrants did, because we're still in the inner city. We have similar high school performance rates, for example, or mass incarceration. Yes, assimilation is absolutely an example of the below moving above and doing nothing to disrupt this logic. Instead, it just adds to it, it reinforces it because it looks less stark, the oppression. It's no longer just white people in the above. It's non-white people. It's not just men in the above, it's also women. And so then that can really confuse us because it looks so multicultural and it blurs the lines. But we see that this logic continues because when we hear oppressed communities or people who go above, they're always differentiating themselves from their own prior community. You know, if you're a poor white person, then you start making fun of poor white people. If you are Mexican and you speak English with a US accent, then you start making fun of people who don't speak English, for example. So yes, absolutely, assimilation, that was those arrows going up, and the exit, the escape, the flight, that is necessary, and assimilation then needs to be rejected. Assimilation, just to wrap that up, is very much assimilating into what? Into the one world, into the world of just one way and extinguishing other worlds. You notice many Mexicans, Central Americans do not consider themselves Native American, even though the majority of us are Native American. And that is a massive campaign to assimilate into Europeanness, into whiteness, even if we may not look white, by no longer speaking our language, by no longer even knowing that we had traditions, by no longer even knowing our history as Native American. So that extermination of the Native American has taken place physically and also mentally, and it's assimilation. Are there any other thoughts or comments? We have a few minutes.
Mugita, Erica, Emma, Madison, any of the students here, Betty, or non-students even, Luz, Sherry?
I don't have any questions, but I just want to congratulate you, I guess, or just commend you in saying how good. I think you went over a lot and it really explained a lot of information that I wasn't aware of. And so I just think you did a really great job overall presenting.
Thank you, Madison. I appreciate that a lot. I'm trying to write this book in a more popular, non-academic way, and these conversations really help to hear that kind of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have a question. Yeah. So how come the Israelis were able to occupy the Palestinian land so quickly? Like, would they have like a strong military or something like that?
Yeah, they received a lot of weapon support from the great powers from the West, because it was very beneficial to the West, because as a Zionist movement, as you know, it marketed itself as, we can be for you a presence in this quote unquote sea of barbarism. And so it was very much supported by the old imperial powers who were now the powers of empire, just no longer calling themselves imperial powers, like, Britain and France, and then later it becomes the United States. Yeah, that's a really great question. Any other thoughts before we wrap up? I'm really, really glad that this was helpful for some folks. In the chat, Antonio Lopez, I missed the first portion of the presentation. I wonder how the blue line model applies to the relationship between Mexico and Guatemala, especially looking back to the 80s and Guatemaltecos fleeing to Chiapas just a few years before the public actions of the Zapatista army. Yes, actually what's interesting is that before I did my PhD, decided to do my PhD research on the borders of Palestine, I was supposed to be doing it on the border of Mexico and Guatemala. I was in Chiapas, but I had started a self-study on Palestine, and I couldn't stop thinking about it because it kind of felt like one of those moments where like the world has lied to you and you're heartbroken and you need to heal. And so all I could do was just study Palestine, and thank God my advisor was so great. She encouraged me to just change it all and do the borders of Palestine. Mexico, Guatemala is fascinating because, as we've seen with caravans, if you've been paying attention to the caravans from Central America going into Mexico, we see a lot of xenophobia against Central Americans by Mexicans. And that actually is something that happens with where Mexico as a country is understands itself as superior to neighboring Guatemala. And then Guatemala understands itself superior to neighboring El Salvador. Like it goes that way. Like the closer you are to the US, like the more superior you're supposed to be, until you hit Costa Rica, then it changes. It's arbitrary. But yeah, that border is Mexico and Guatemala is very much starting to look a lot like the US-Mexico border. A lot of, in fact, the Zapatistas have been saying that the mega projects of the current Mexican administration to create like these corridors is really trying to is building the wall, Trump's wall, by having Mexico itself be the wall, policing Central American migration into the US. And it's 11:15, so looks like
Yeah,
we need to go on
we have to end, unfortunately, but we could obviously go on. Thank you so much, Linda, and everyone for participating, and hope to see you at some of the other sessions too. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you, Riyadh.
Bye.